Okay, so today we'll be considering Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 21. We won't be reading the last few verses of this passage. It's a story about Abimelech and him and Abraham shoring up their relationship still further. But this is a story where if it seems a bit repetitive or like you've heard this before, there's a reason for that. This is the second time that Hagar has been kicked out of the house, so to speak, and into the wilderness by her master, her owner, but also the father of her child, Abraham. And one wants to know if this is two different tellings of the same event, or we're meant to understand it as two different tellings of the same event, or if we're meant to think that this is something that happened on two separate occasions. Well, as is the case with other similar stories where we have these repeats, whether you're talking about the story of Noah and the ark, where there's two stories kind of meshed together, or whether you're talking about the two different stories and soon to be three similar stories where someone's wife is pawned off as one's sister to secure one's safety. They come from different sources. They come from different sources that I do not think were in communication with one another. They were sources that were writing down stories that were being transmitted orally. So in Genesis chapter 16, that came from the Yahwist source, using what's translated in the English Lord God, or Yahweh Elohim. In this story, we have the sort of generic word for God, Elohim. So this is from the Elohist source. And that's why in the English translation, it's God is rendered just simply G-O-D, not capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, God, as is common with the stories from the Yahwist source. But all this said, I think that by the time the redactor or redactors, meaning the ones who compiled the Torah in its current form, by the time it arrives at that point in its finalized form, I do believe it is their intent for us to view this story as a repeat occurrence of what transpired in Genesis chapter 16. So according to the final version of the Abraham narrative as we receive it, as we're meant to read it, as if you were reading a story in a book, a chapter book, this is something that does happen twice. You may also recall that in the first telling of the story, the reasons for Hagar's expulsion are different. The NRSV says that the reason was Sarah, or then Sarai, took umbrage at Hagar looking at her with contempt, and so she was, for that reason, sent out into the desert, pregnant with Abram's child. In this story, one might at first blush think it has something to do with the interaction between Ishmael and Isaac, the little 3-year-old that they're celebrating in this story. But Sarah actually names her reason, and it is different than the one given in chapter 16. And so we'll get to that here in a second. So without further ado, let's go into the text. First, promise fulfilled. Verse 1 of chapter 21. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have ever said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So finally, after years of promise with no follow through, now it has finally happened. Sarah is a mother at last, and she is thrilled, probably, I'm guessing, as this text would suggest. She's feelings of laughter at the absurdity of the thing, but the joy of the thing seems to be the most dominant emotion. She's thrilled at both her son's arrival and the unlikeliness of his birth. She names him Isaac, which means he laughs. His birth seems to be something like a divine joke on the world. God has made a way to life against all odds. Isaac is circumcised on the 8th day as prescribed back in Genesis chapter 17. But one last note, and we'll be circling back to this Hebrew word and significance as it relates to what comes later. In verse 6, let's read that again. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Not laugh at me, not laugh in a mocking way, but they will be in on the joke and share in my joy. This is the way that we are meant to read this. It comes from a Hebrew word, tzakak, which means to laugh, but it also has a few other meanings at certain times in certain contexts as well. And we'll get back to that here in a moment. As a matter of fact, on this slide, we will get to that. I'm going to read to you two different translations of these next few verses to note one difference in the translating that does make a difference in the interpretation of this text, or what we're meant to think is happening here in this text. I'll read from the NRSV first. The child grew and was weaned. I put in the final notes that the time of weaning a child was anywhere from 2 to 4 years after birth. So Isaac is about 3 years old. This is important because most children don't live this long. And so this is a celebration of the fact that now that they have reached 3, there's a solid chance that they're going to make it into young adulthood and hopefully into an adulthood. So that's why they would celebrate their weaning. Very significant back when child mortality rates were higher. So he was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. So that's the way the NRSV reads this. The NIV and other translations, a more traditional reading, goes as follows, and note the difference. The child grew and was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. So far, so good. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne to Abraham was mocking, not playing with, but was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Now, the motive is the same in both of these translations, but the event that seems to have spurned Sarah to going to her husband and complaining and asking that Hagar and Ishmael be kicked out of camp is different. One it says was mocking, and one it says playing with. Both translations of the same Hebrew word, which is, guess what? Tzakak. That same word that Sarah used to describe how people would share in the joy and share in the joke with her at the birth of Isaac at his old age. It's the same exact Hebrew word. So what gives? Why do translators translate it in a flattering way back in verse 6, and then 3 verses later translate it as was mocking in some instances? Well, the word means to laugh, can mean to mock, and can also mean to play. And so how a translator would translate this, I think, reveals a lot about what we want to project onto these characters. If you are wanting to give Sarah a better reason for kicking the mother of her husband's child out of the camp, then you might go with mocking, right? Give her a reason for being incensed or upset. By the way, I still think that that's a bad reason to kick anybody out into the desert. Especially any casual observer of children will know that both mocking and playing are normal behaviors for siblings. So, Josie just yesterday was doing something to June that was teasing. It was not very kind. I think even if June were my stepchild of a different mother, kicking her out of the house, or kicking Josie out of the house if Josie were like my stepdaughter of a different mother, kicking her out of the house, I think would be a bit harsh is too soft a word for it. But either way you cut it, this is normal behavior for children. And I think, given the fact that Ishmael is likely 16 or 17, that the most likely translation, or what we're supposed to think probably, is that they were playing or that they were enjoying one another's company. which also makes sense of what Sarah does next. Because remember, her motive is not that the mocking happened. Her motive is that she wants her son Isaac to inherit everything. And here what we have, if they are playing or if they're mocking, whichever, a scene of domestic life where Ishmael fits, and so does Hagar, part of the family. And what follows next suggests that this is probably a better way of looking at it too, because Abraham, at Sarah's request, is troubled. He's worried for his son and only follows through with what Sarah has suggested because God tells him that it will be okay, that there will be, that Ishmael will also become part of a great nation and a great people. So that's the only reason he agrees to do it. So for several reasons, I think that playing with is a better translation. One, the way that the same Hebrew word is translated just 3 verses back, as in laughing and not in a mocking way. And also given the context of a 16-year-old boy and at a festival, at a feast, you may even picture him bouncing his 3-year-old brother on his knee. Might be a way that you could read this. And I personally think it's a more plausible reading of it. So whatever Sarah's trigger was, although this discussion about whether it was the mocking or the laughing or the playing or whatever it was, her motive is made clear in verse 10. She said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman," doesn't even name her, "this slave woman with her son," not your son, her son. "For the son of this slave woman," again, not your son, Abraham, her son, "shall not inherit along with my son, Isaac." So she's worried that the child she more or less commissioned will serve as a threat to her own child's future. I want to say, oh ye of little faith, after all they've already been through. Back in chapter 16, Sarah took matters into her own hands by making Hagar her property, make a baby with her husband. Now she has what she always wanted. She wants her husband's the eldest son, out of the picture now that she has what she has always wanted. Here is a motive born out of a lack of trust in God and probably no small amount of jealousy. And as I've been saying, she doesn't even call her by her name, but this slave woman. Verse 11 reads, by the way, to get this picture to the right, I just typed in Abraham stressed out. That's what I did. So yeah, verse 11 reads, "The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." And so Abraham does what Sarah wants because he's given assurance that things will be all right with Hagar and with Ishmael. So either way you cut it, Abraham does not share in Sarah's sentiments. Abraham shows that he cares about his son, and why shouldn't he? Then God speaks into the situation. Some commentators see God's acquiescence to Sarah's cruel plan as evidence that God approves of Sarah's plan. However, I find it far more plausible that God is merely being diplomatic. God is making a way for both children to prosper, for it seems that Ishmael cannot flourish in his father's house in light of his stepmother's contempt and jealousy for him. Fritham writes along these lines, "Here again, God chooses to work through complex situations and imperfect human beings on behalf of the divine purposes. God works with individuals on the scene. God does not perfect people before deciding to work through them. God may see Sarah's strategy, however inadequate, as the best possible way into the future for this particular moment in the life of this family. But rest assured, God will not abandon Ishmael. This is the reassurance given Abraham. As was promised back in chapter 16, God will make a nation of Ishmael, and he will be blessed by virtue of his being Abraham's offspring." And here again, we have another one of those classic historically accurate renderings of the story. Verse 14. "So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered around the wilderness of Beersheba. True to form, Hagar and Ishmael's wandering in the wilderness fits a pattern, again mirroring Israel's later experience, as does the provision of water. Writes Freetham. Loads of stories where the Israelites and the descendants of Abraham will be wandering in the desert in pursuit of sustenance or life or assurance, or faced with various obstacles. They often find themselves in the wilderness. And here we have Hagar and Ishmael being subsumed into that tradition, or being, or at least echoing that tradition. Ishmael is too Abraham's son. Abraham's children will often find themselves wandering in the wilderness. Ishmael is no exception. He is truly Abraham's child. Verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. Here we have Hagar completely without hope. She is destitute and dying of thirst along with her son. She is so miserable, she can't even look on the death of her son, and so she leaves him away off. Seemingly abandoned, she is truly a pitiable figure. For those commentators who have viewed Hagar in a negative light, as someone who is reaping what she's sown, God's subsequent verses must surely give them pause. For, verse 17, we read, "And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him.' Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink." There are a few things that stick out to me in these verses. First, God responds to Ishmael's voice. Her lament and Ishmael's are telescoped, writes Freetham. So God is considering both parties here. Two, God responds to Hagar by name. No more diminutive slave girl slander. Her name is spoken by God's messenger, thus partially restoring the dignity she lost as slave girl. Also, if you can remember, back in chapter 16, it was Hagar who gave God a name. If you can remember, she named God back in chapter 16 and gave him a unique name, which I should have written down here, was El Roy, the God who sees. And so now God names her, or calls her by name. Three, God's care and concern for Hagar, the Egyptian, and Ishmael, the rejected son, are obvious. God does not need to lead them to life, but does anyway. The implications are that God is not only concerned with Israel's future, but the future of all humans of whatever status or tribe. And this story concludes, sort of some wrapping up sentences here. Verse 20, God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him in the land of Egypt. God was with Ishmael. This is an intriguing, seemingly throwaway line that makes me wonder what a more detailed narrative of Ishmael might go like. Surely there is a larger story here, a narrative worth exploring. The biblical text, however, quickly brings the focus back to Abraham and Isaac. More on this in the final takeaways, but first I will comment on the picture that we see here. I have noticed a difference in the artwork about these stories of Hagar when filtered through a European, then North American lens, as opposed to the way that most other nations across the globe read these stories. The stories, when filtered through a Euro-American lens, often want to paint Hagar in a negative light, as if there was some reason that she deserved what happened, that Sarah's contempt for her in 16 justified her sending her out into the wilderness, that Sarah's taking umbrage at whatever the nature of the interaction was between Ishmael and her son Isaac, and the threat that he posed to inheriting part of her son's inheritance were legitimate reasons. But other cultures, cultures that have often been not the benefactors of imperialism, I'll put it that way, but the ones who have been subjugated by imperialism, whether it's the British Empire, French Empire, or other empires, they actually see Hagar as a hero of their faith, alongside Sarah for different reasons, but also a hero of the faith, one who persevered. And they see Ishmael also in a similar light. And so if you type in Hagar, Ishmael, African, or Hagar, Ishmael, Near Eastern, or any other word that would bring it out of the Euro-American context, these are the kind of pictures you get. Ones that hold them up as also heroes of our faith narratives. And I got to say, too, the ones that paint Hagar in unflattering lights, listen, if we're talking about chapter 16, where she looked on contempt at Sarai, I don't care if she blew the biggest raspberry at her or stuck her tongue out or whatever it was. It's always a cruel thing to send somebody into the desert without sustenance or enough to live on, to where they find themselves wasting away. And in this story too, I think that the reasons of jealousy are also not laudable at all. And so I just don't understand why interpreters of this story have tried so hard to get Sarah off the hook and also pull Hagar's name through the mud. So to conclude, some takeaways. This story encapsulates several themes common to texts we've considered previously. Most notably, God's care and concern for the outcast, the outsider, and the foreigner. Dominant narratives seem hyper-focused on the story of God's interactions and interventions on behalf of Abraham's lineage through Isaac. But here, God's focus is on the castaway Egyptian slave woman Hagar and her teenage son. God sustains them as God would time and again sustain Israel throughout the Exodus narrative. God leads them to water. God seems or is as concerned with Hagar and Ishmael as God is with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc. The text reads, God was with the boy. God was with the boy. After his expulsion, after he's outside of Abraham's story and is a story in his own right, God is with the boy. We should never assume that God is absent in the lives of those outside of our in-group, tribe, culture, country, or even religion. I am reminded of a quote from C.S. Lewis from his classic Mere Christianity when he writes, "But the truth is, God has not told us his arrangement about the other people, about what his arrangement with the other people are." Let me start that over. But the truth is, God has not told us about his arrangement with the other people. We do not know that no man can be saved. I butchered this in it when I wrote it down.
We do know that no man can be saved.
It says, we do know that no man can be saved except through Christ. We do not know that only those who know him can be saved through him, writes C.S. Lewis. As was noted when we considered Hagar's story back in Genesis chapter 16, many modern readers of this story project judgment and condemnation back onto Hagar, as if Sarah were justified to send a woman and her child out into the desert to fend for themselves. Hagar has been depicted in art in unflattering ways, as unduly proud or as a seductress. But a careful reading of the text does not justify such condemnation. A fair reading should cast her as a victim to her times and customs, an outcast by no fault of her own. And I conclude with a quote from Miguel de la Torre. I ended the last Hagar lesson with a quote from him, and this is a quote from the same chapter, but a different quote about this story. And it reads, "The second time the Bible returns to Hagar, she has been cast out by those who own her. Sarah's jealousy got the better of her. Fearful that her son's inheritance could be jeopardized by Abraham's firstborn, Ishmael, she connived to have him and his mother Hagar forced into exile. Again, Hagar found herself in the desert facing death, thrown out as an old used object no longer needed by its owner, a familiar scenario for most domestic servants today. Homeless because of the unwillingness of the father of her child to shoulder his responsibility, she was abandoned, like so many women of color today, alone in the desert, facing death, and questioning the promise God previously uttered about the multitude of her descendants. She must have wondered about the blindness of the God who sees, yet this time, God heard the cry of her son and rescued them. Hagar suffered from classism, she's a slave, racism, an Egyptian foreigner, and sexism, a woman raped by Abraham. Because of her status, Hagar becomes a lens by which the biblical text can be read, a reading that focuses on the struggle for liberation and survival with dignity. This story of the used and abused woman is a motif that resonates with many women of color today. Even natural allies, women of the dominant culture, like Sarah, capitalize on her body. Nevertheless, God is found in the midst of the struggle of those relegated to the margins, even when these religious patriarchs of the faith have participated in their marginalization. Because God chooses to accompany those who are disenfranchised, Hagar and her child Ishmael complicated the history of salvation by becoming part of God's promise to make a nation by using Abraham's seed. Women of color continue to complicate how the dominant culture interprets God's promises. All right, bring us back. And you may unmute yourselves if you want.
So I was not remembering the first time that Hagar left. I know that Sarah was not treating her well. This is my understanding. Sarah was not treating her well. So she just decided to go out and leave. But then when she's in the desert, the Lord comes to her and sends her back. And I don't think that's the same here. Abraham is sending her out with provisions.
Right. Yeah. In the first one, Sarai dealt harshly with her and she ran away. And because she went to Abram and Abraham complained to Abram, and Abraham said, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." And then she dealt harshly, and then he ran away. She ran away. Yeah, that's important distinction. You're right. That is a difference between the two stories. In one instance, she's driven into the desert.
One she made the decision. I'm not saying that Sarai treated her well and Hagar shouldn't have run away. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's Hagar that made the decision to run or to leave. And in the last story, it was Abraham, because of Sarai, sent her out.
Yeah, there's a difference there. Well, in the first story, I'm reminded of those circumstances where somebody might find themselves in a destitute place, and true, they might like leave the abusive home, but there's still a very limited and very bad options. Whilst in this story, she really didn't have a choice in the matter. You could even imagine, perhaps, since her son is 16 years old and she's been there that long, that she might have could have seen her seen a future there. I think my read on this is that that's part of what made Sarah jealous, because she is now seeing that this is that Ishmael is a part of the family fabric. Is at this big festival just to celebrate the weaning of their 3-year-old, and she doesn't want him to share in the inheritance. And clearly, Abraham is troubled by this too. He doesn't want to. Says he was distressed.
When I think about how desperate somebody must be if they're a stranger. I mean, she's a slave and she's pregnant. She's with child. She knows she is. I mean, that was one of the reasons why Sarai was dealing with her so harshly, was because she felt belittled by her attitude, by Hagar's attitude. For her to choose to run out into the desert where there's nothing, no food, no water, her treatment must have been pretty terrible. So to say she chose to flee, I don't know. I mean, I think it must have been pretty bad. So I don't know if there was a choice.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. It must have been bad, or she would not have fled.
Yeah. I
But-
think it was bad.
And it's
So
still her decision. I think about all these women that are in these abusive situations, and they have broken bones and scars physically, mentally as well as physically, and yet they continue to stay. So I don't know.
Well, the psychology of abuse and what it does to the abused victim. People on the outside often ask that question: why would they stay so long? And there are very complex reasons why, but there's been extensive research on instances where perhaps somebody might have undergone intense abuse for decades or more, with every option to leave, hating it, and yet feeling the prospect of the unfamiliar more terrifying than the familiar, the abuse that they know. And those who have been on the inside of that, in their testimonies, if they do get out, are oftentimes what a lot of the work that they have to do. Like I say, they left a cult, for instance. I study people who have been abused in cults, and it's one of my niche interests. And when they leave, they say one of the first things that they have to do is develop a deep sense of patience for those who are like, well, I don't see how you got sucked into that, and how could you not see it was all crazy? And they say you have to kind of be there and see the layers and the baby steps of manipulation that get somebody entrenched and enmeshed in something so
I think a
insidious.
lot of these women that are in these situations is because when they were a child, they were in a home where that existed, and that is their normal, and so they accept it as their normal.
Patterns
Well,
of abuse.
yeah, I think that it's ironic that that the mother of all nations, like Abraham, the father of all nations, was a racist bitch. But think about it. God chose his most imperfect people and elevated them to this status. But to me, she was a horrible bitch, racist, and she wanted to use the servant until she got her own son, and she said no kid that is of color should inherit it. So she was desperate at that time to have a son for Abraham, so she tolerated it. But as soon as she got what she wanted, she had her own son, her true colors came out. So Sarah is not a really wonderful woman that we've all rejoiced in and stuff. That's all. That's what I have to say.
Well,
What is
she
the
made,
nation that Ishmael founded or was had?
Well,
The
Arabic
Canaanites,
nations.
didn't it?
the
The
tradition
Canaanite-
says what would become the Arabic nations, and in Muslim traditions, he is the true heir of the promise. But that way of seeing the story that we read today would develop in layers and layers over the course of centuries. The way that national narratives are woven together. If you're trying to get down to actual like historic persons and who like genetically they were the father, the forebears of, it's hard to really say. In the biblical narrative, they settled, as it said, in this place called Paran, and got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And I don't know.
I don't know why. I always thought they were the Canaanites.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll look into that and try to have the answer next week.
Because it does say, God said he would, make him a head of a
Yeah.
nation or something too. So
And isn't the Canaanites the one they fought against mostly? Israel fought
Well, yeah.
against it.
They
Yeah.
if they fought against a lot of.
But there's some in chapter 15. There's already reference to the Canaanites.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I thought somehow that Abraham was like the father of all the Middle Eastern religions, including Islam. I mean, I thought he was like the some descendant of some distant relative of Muhammad, and so therefore it was like the beginning, the root of it is not that he created Islam, but that he was somehow related to the genetic forebears of Islam. But I don't know, maybe I made that up.
We don't know. That's a tradition about it, that he was the genetic forebear. What I'm saying is, like, you know, when it comes to these genealogies, as has been the case in previous ones, whether we're to read them as like a detailed record of who begat who, or rather part of a broader national narrative that is, you know, kind of unmoored from history. You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah. Okay.
But in the biblical narrative, we have actually children of him listed. I'm reading. I went straight to, just like any bad student, went straight to Wikipedia, and it says that after roaming the wilderness for some time, Ishmael and his mother settled in the desert of Paran, as we just read, became an expert in archery, as we just read, found a wife in Egypt, as we just read. They had 12 sons, each who became tribal chiefs throughout the regions of Havilah to Shur, from Assyria to the borders of Egypt. And then it lists their sons. I won't name them here. But also later in Genesis, Ishmael comes into the burial of Abraham. So he comes back into the narrative once more to go to the burial of Ishmael. So they called them the Ishmaelites. That's who there's even an article on just the Ishmaelites, known broadly as the descendants of Ishmael. So.
Well, a couple of things that occurred to me, and they may be meaningless, but in this whole chapter, his name isn't mentioned. He's just referred to as the boy. Hagar's name is said, like you said, but even by God called to Hagar, but I don't think his name is ever said. And then the other thing, to say that she was a bow shot away from him, and then the bow was his big deal. He became this fabulous archer. Is that some kind of foreshadowing, or is that no big thing at all?
I don't know. I thought the same thing. Just because you have a bow mentioned as bow shot and then becomes an archer or good with the bow a few sentences later. And I honestly don't know what to make of that detail. I've
got John's iPad and I'm looking too. And I just lost it. It said they went to, is it Paran?
That's how I read it. Paran. Yeah.
And where was it? I just lost it. I was trying to scan ahead for the next, but then it said he became a 15, that's too far back. It said he became mystic the next morning. I don't want to misquote it because it's very negative. He became like a robber and was not a nice person. I thought it was the very first paragraph of the section.
That was in the when God spoke to Hagar out in the desert the first time, and they were saying like he was kind of red skinned and all this stuff. But it was
oh yeah,
he would be hairy and like a wild thing. But it could be interpreted in a positive way. He'd be full of might and fury, and
in the time of that, when that text was written, to be a wild sort of warrior. Think Samson is that. Samson is a warrior hero in the biblical world. That is just this man, this ox of a man that
is wild ass of a man. That's it. Yeah.
Is out. Yeah, wild ass of a man out. tackling bears. That's Samson, and
That's
and getting beehives out of, like just doing all kinds of things. That was a compliment back then, but I had not heard that. You'll have to send me that, Sue.
This is this I found. It says Ishmael became a bandit, robbing passing travelers. So, and then it said, oh, I don't know. I'm trying to read and think at the same time. It doesn't work. Abraham and Ish continued to visit with each other.
What is it that you're reading from?
Chabad.org. I just punched in what country did Ishmael establish, and I clicked on this one, CHABAD.org. Ishmael, Abraham's other son, is what it's called.
Okay, I'll look into that. I had never heard anything about him becoming a robber. If that's my guess, just having heard it for the first time, is that it could be one of the traditions that developed around his personality. What happened? What tended to happen? What always seems to happen with the story, with the figures in our scriptures, is that traditions develop that are perhaps historical, but often ahistorical, and you can never really know if they're truthful. Not that the people making up the stories are lying or that they're made up, but that they're not the stories as they're found in the scriptural text. And so the one that I like to point as an example from the Christian scriptures is this tradition that Peter was crucified upside down. You may have heard that he was crucified upside down because he did not want to be crucified like his Lord and Savior. Well, there is no historical record of this occurring, nor is it in the scriptures. It is just a story that has been held in the traditions that has been held long enough to become one of those Peter stories that are, I guess you would say, apocryphal. Matches the zeal and the trustworthiness of Peter after Jesus left, so it fits his personality. Did it happen? We can't really say. And I would suspect that this story of Ishmael is sort of a similar thing. Maybe I never heard it before.
This also says that eventually Ishmael repented and made up with his brother Isaac, and when it came time to bury their father, Ishmael honored his brother by letting Isaac go first. It doesn't really say exactly what nation came from him, only that he went to that one country. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I will look into these things. I will, and we'll maybe touch on them briefly before next week. But next week we're getting into Genesis chapter 22, which is a big story. If you've read ahead, I don't need to tell you that. And a controversial story, but also a story that is brought up again and again and again. Especially in the Christian scriptures, where Abraham is told to sacrifice his son Isaac and complies, and then what happens next is fairly well known. So anyway, I will get to that next week, and thank you for joining and for your comments and input, and until next time.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
All right.
Well, Sunday.
Till
That's
Sunday.
a Sunday.
Too.
Yeah.